Martin, good to see you after so long. How are you?
I'm okay. I mean, it's we're in times we wished we weren't in. So we've got we're moving through Luke, and we've got to Luke 16, the first 13 verses. Unjust steward, and then you can't serve God and Mammon. So what do you make of it?
So let me focus on the unjust steward, because this is a bizarre parable. I mean, Rudolf Bultmann, one of the great theologians of the 20th century, said that this was incomprehensible. Now, the Latin for comprehendo means you fully understand it. So you could say that about any of Jesus' parables, but I think he meant it in the sense that you couldn't make any sense of it. And Justin the Apostate, way back in the 2nd century, says this shows why Christianity and its founder are inferior to other ways, because it just doesn't make any sense. So what happens is this steward is being sacked by his boss for poor stewardship, and what he goes and does is he gets the debtors to write off their debts, saying that this is what the boss effectively wants to happen. And that happens, and that leaves the boss in this dilemma. Do I now actually say, no, I'd already sacked this steward, and therefore get the irritation of the people because he's not as generous as they thought he was? Or does he take the plaudits and who think he's being very generous and graceful and accept it? So, and Jesus suggests that we should applaud the prudence and the wisdom of this unjust steward for acting in this way. So you can see why somebody like Bultmann or Justin the Apostate would be a little bit dubious about this way of being. So what's going on here? What's happening? So to drill a bit more deeply into it, Eugene Peterson, the great American spirituality writer, gives an example of this when he was going to visit a hospital as a pastor. And he arrived at this hospital, and he was praying that he could find a parking place, because normally you can't find a parking place, and he found one. So he was very self-congratulatory about the fact that, thank you Lord, thank you Lord. So he went up to, and then he came down when he'd finished the visit, and he found that his car keys were still in the ignition in the car with the car locked. So he was cursing his bad luck, when this 10-year-old streetwise kid from around the corner saw him and said, "You've got a problem there, mister." He said, "Yeah, I can't get into the car." I said, "Would you like some help?" He said, "Yeah, I would." So this 10-year-old got this kind of implement out and shoved it down the window and managed to open the car. And Eugene said, "Oh, thank you very much." He said, "Well, is it worth something to you? Is it worth $1? And Eugene said, "Yeah, actually it's worth $2 to me. Thank you so much, well done." And he said that was his first introduction to something of the wisdom of the unjust steward, that this boy with dubious talents was being praised by him for helping him out of a difficult spot. But he says that the person you need to turn to, Eugene says, for understanding this is Kenneth Bailey, who lived in Palestine for so many years and is a great commentator on the New Testament, somebody who Tom Wright said gives eyes to the blind when we're reading a parable like this. And he says, if you look at it carefully, what's going on here is the unjust steward, when he's being sacked for his poor management, he notices two things about the boss who sacks him. First of all, he sacks him. In other words, you've crossed the line, so you're inadequate, you're incompetent, you're out. But secondly, he doesn't punish him. He doesn't punish him. He just sacks him. So he notices there is some mercy here. There is grace here. So what he then does, because he asks himself, what are the things I could possibly do now? And he comes up with no really good answer, except the strategy of maybe riskily throwing himself on the fulsome grace and mercy of the boss that he's seen by this way of cancelling the debts of all the debtors in the boss's name. And it says in the text he does it quickly. Why does he do it quickly? Because the debtors don't yet know that he's been sacked by the boss, because they wouldn't be parties to this otherwise. But he does it, and as I said earlier, the boss is then left in this dilemma at the end. Do I accept the generous image I have amongst all of my debtors now, and actually this is aligned with how I am mercifully and gracefully, or not? So he commends the unjust steward for his wisdom in acting in this way. And the word he uses is prudence, for his prudence.
Yeah.
And that's a really key word, I think, because prudence these days we've associated with prude and something not necessarily particularly highly valued or prized as a virtue. But prudent in those days was something that was wise in the way in which we attend to the ways of the world and the ways of God. And that is precisely the kind of virtue that we need, prudence. And incidentally, is something we see and have seen, I think, in our Queen, in the way that she handled the ways of the world at the same time as being attentive to the ways of God. But Bailey says that actually this parable is a slam dunk, typical example of Jesus emphasizing the nature of grace and mercy. And actually the unjust steward throwing himself in confidence and trust on the grace and mercy is at the heart of the good news. It's not incomprehensible, a la Bultmann. But given these times and where we are now, have you got any connections that you'd want to make between this and the Queen and her example?
So, well, there's one general point, which is that we have to beware of trying to look for too many details in a parable. The parable has one point normally, or at the most two, and so what you've just done is explicate what the point of that parable. And Jesus tells parables in order to shock. I mean, people will be saying, "What on earth are you saying? You can't possibly say that," which is the whole point of Jesus telling the parable, because he wants to open people up to asking questions. You need to shock them into thinking, "Oh, that's really bizarre." And it's a bit like, last week it would have been the lost shepherd, the lost sheep, and leaving the 99. And say, you don't leave 99 sheep for the sake of one. What are you talking about? So it's that kind of shock tactic. I suppose. I mean, I jumped to the end of the passage, and where there's a sort of commentary, and the line, "You can't serve God and Mammon," and I'm struck by some of the reflections I've read about our late and beloved Queen, where you've got someone who's in a position of extraordinary wealth, and that wealth is used in all sorts of ways for the benefit of the well-being of the family and so forth. But actually, when you look at how the Queen exercised her role, this is the point one commentator I was reading made, she took that privilege, which you could imagine somebody using really for their own purposes, or the benefit didn't actually extend much beyond, but took that privilege and transformed it into a vocation of service, so that everything that she had and was entrusted to her, and in that sense it's not personal wealth, but entrusted to her, became an instrument for Christian service. And I think so when you stumble upon the line about you can't serve God and Mammon, I think I would be pretty clearly saying absolutely true. And whilst the Queen had an extraordinary amount of Mammon at her disposal, it was God that she was always serving. And I think, and you can see that in her priorities, you can see that in the way in which that disposition of service just was sustained. That commitment she made when she was 21, that whether my life is long or short, to devote her life to service, and that when you look at whether it's on the global stage, whether it's engaging with political leaders, whether it's visiting a local community project or whatever it was, that essential disposition of service was how that wealth, in a sense, was put itself into service.
Yeah.
And I think it's very different from thinking about people who make a lot of money and then use it for their own purposes, and just for their own purposes. We're thinking of someone whose vocation became to embody and point us to higher values that whatever else was going on, that's what we were being summoned to, and we thank God that those higher values were Christian values.
Yeah.
And were very clearly and fully Christian values in her case. So I think that's where I was thinking when I saw the passage. I thought, oh my goodness, we're all going to be needing to preach in relation to again, and last week as well, but again in relation to the Queen's death.
Yeah, and it's an echo of Catholic social teaching and Christian social teaching, what you're saying, that model, because Mammon does refer to something wider than money, as you say. It's property and the whole bag. And from the social teaching point of view, what is property for? What is the stuff we have for? Well, obviously we need stuff to take care of ourselves and to take care of those we're responsible for. And then, for all the rest of it, to be serving others and taking care of those others. And that's something of what we see in the Queen's relationship with Mammon and God.
Interesting, I didn't have a chance to explore this more fully, but apparently Amen and Mammon have the same roots, and both of them are about trust. So Mammon is what you trust in, and Amen is saying, yes, we trust that, yes.
Yeah.
So there's one certainly can't serve God and Mammon in the sense that you either trust God or you trust money, and in a most paradoxical way, I think when we reflect upon it, the Queen, through how she exercised her vocation, called us, in an age which is increasingly sought to trust money, away from that to trusting God and God's service through people, through caring for others, through reaching out, through prayer and worship.
And perhaps no mistake then that the unjust steward follows straight on in Jesus' teaching and ministry from the parable of the prodigal son, who finds the emptiness of trusting in money and all of that self-serving pleasure, and turns back and finds at the core of existence grace and relational grace, which is also at the core of the parable of the unjust steward, and then leads on to that summary about God and man.
And there are echoes in the language of the parable of the unjust steward from the prodigal son.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.